Hi everyone, welcome back to this course on Sociology of Media and Communication. Today we are going to talk about another approach and theoretical perspective to understand media. This is lecture number 11 and we are now on to unit 2. So, in the previous lecture we discussed about the materialization and dematerialization turn as well as the relationship between media and technology and the political economy to understand how we could think about media from a different kind of theoretical vantage point. Today we will continue this discussion by focusing on the Frankfurt school and the Neo-Marxist approach. So, when we think about the Frankfurt school, it is actually developed as a critical theory of society and culture by a particular group of neo-Marxist thinkers in Germany. And this group plays a very crucial role in understanding how media and culture operates within capitalism. Please also note that this is the time when capitalism is on the rise and we have different kinds of thinkers, be it Karl Marx or Max Weber, etc., who are trying to make sense of how capitalism impacts human life and society. The Frankfurt school is also similar to how they look at society and culture, but primarily also focus on these intersections between media, culture and capitalism. So, some of the key figures particularly include Theodor Adorno, Horkheimer and Marcuse. And we will talk about Adorno particularly in this context, because he has a lot to say about how the critical theorist or how we could think about media and culture also from a vantage point of culture and capitalism. Now, the focus for these theorists generally is on mass media, ideology, domination and social control. So, first of all, they can be called neo-Marxist because one can observe that there is a shift from classical Marxism. Now, when we think about classical Marxist theory, it is primarily focused on economic structures and their understanding, whereas this Frankfurt school focuses on culture, media and consciousness. This idea of consciousness is very central to what we will discuss in terms of Adorno's understanding of media and culture. Now, essentially what Adorno discusses in his essay called On the Schema of Mass Culture is that capitalism or capital does not possess immediate emancipatory forces, but there is a drift towards integration and domination. What this means is that when we think about capitalism, it is not only an economic structure or system, but there is an integration of larger cultural, social, political forces into it. Now, therefore, this shift from classical Marxism is towards understanding primarily media and how there is an intersection with capitalism. So, questions of culture are linked to questions of power, ideology and domination, and the neo-Marxist thinkers, they focus on media and consciousness. So, consciousness is a big part of how they want to think about the role of media, particularly in a capitalist society. So, when we talk about Theodor Adorno, he is known for writing about what he would call the culture industry. Now, what is this culture industry is primarily rooted in the understanding of a commodity. So, in capitalism, when we think about, let us say, Marxist writings, a commodity is something which has a value. This value could be either an use value or an exchange value. Now, what Adorno observes through his writings and of particularly modern Western society at that period, let us say 1920s and 30s, is primarily this understanding that culture itself becomes a commodity. So, how does this happen? This happens because products which are of cultural in nature or character are tailored for consumption by masses, and these products are also manufactured according to a plan where profit is very central to how culture becomes a commodity and is industrialized. So, for instance, what he talks about is also this idea of mass culture. I had briefly alluded to it in the previous lectures where we discussed how capitalism primarily transforms the public sphere into a public culture, And therefore, when we think about culture as well, it undergoes these changes where we have to think about the commodification of culture. This commodification is rooted in the nature of capitalism itself, where culture and cultural products like music, dance, theatre, art, they become a part of how there is an understanding of these art forms in relationship to profit. So, for instance, one of the examples that I can sort of illustrate to highlight this pattern is to think about how today when we think about singing, dancing, painting, etc., they can no longer just be hobbies. For many, at the school level itself, students are expected to learn these skills and then later on perhaps use them for their benefit through their vocation or a career. What it does is that it takes away these skills and practices which could also be seen as hobbies earlier and transforms them into capitalist practices. If one looks at how reels and algorithms today are designed, particularly in social media platforms like Instagram, it is also a perfect illustration of this industrialization of everyday life. So, while Adorno was talking about in that sense culture becoming a commodity and getting converted into an idea of obtaining profit, the same thing at much larger scale is also happening when we think about Instagram reels, where content, everyday life, etc., all become a part of how an industrialization process takes place. One of the major features of the culture industry, where culture itself is an industry now, is actually standardization or regularization. Now, what standardization means is that there is a repetition and there is a particular standard structure according to which cultural forms and products are produced. So, this also means that when we have particular ways in which concerts are organized or music is released, they have certain structures. For instance, when we think about Bollywood films, at one point of time in the 1990s and early 2000s, the item song in every Bollywood film resembled a standard structure and pattern to attract audiences which would be wanting to watch the item song in action. That actually is part of a standardization process where the repetition of a standard product creates predictability. So, the products that are tailored for consumption by the masses are manufactured according to a plan, and this plan is to have as much profit as possible. So, for instance, when films are made, let us say of a genre of horror or romantic comedy, there would be particular discussions around the content of the film as well as the structure. So, in most films, the idea in a romantic comedy would be to have the two leads unite at the end of the film, because that is the idea of romance and love that is also acceptable to the majority of the society. So, standardization in fact, according to the Neo-Marxist, kills the creativity that art is supposed to imbibe, and that is also where there is a problem in the understanding of how they would see culture becoming more and more popular or mass oriented. We had also discussed this in previous lectures, where we talked about how the popular culture and mass culture is looked down upon primarily because it is associated with non-creativity and also non-aesthetics. Interestingly, the other characteristic that Adorno and other neo-Marxists adhere to what the culture industry and the way that capitalism impacts media does is pseudo-individuality, which is primarily creating an illusion of individuality. Here, what happens is that the audience generally feels unique, but actually ends up consuming sameness. This is also important to maintaining the culture industry, where audience members need to feel that they have an agency, but actually perhaps they don't, in ways that the products of culture are industrialized. It is very, very visible in how we experience cultural products today. I will again take an example from how we watch films in the PVR halls, and there is a particular standardized procedure attached to watching a film, which now one can also see many people calling out on social media, where they target PVRs for overcharging, not only for the tickets, but also for the food, the snacks, etc. Now, while the cultural industry or the culture industry that Adorno talks about did not include this atmospheric or ambience kind of ideas, here if one expands that lens, one can actually see how there is a standardization of a cultural product and its associated ideas of capitalism. Now, if one looks at any movie hall or any theatre, they are generally located in regions where you have also food and snacks available. And most importantly, in many places they are in malls, again indicating how culture, products of culture like films, sports, etc., they are part of how capitalism is actually also sold as a package. It is entertainment. So, in this kind of a portrayal of culture, the neo-Marxists also see the consumer as an object where they are objectified and they are integrated from above. So, the problem with the cultural industry kind of development that neo-Marxists talk about is how consumers become passive recipients rather than active deciders of what content to be consumed or not. And again, this is something which is associated with how culture becomes mass or popular in nature. Media is seen as an ideological apparatus of the state where there is control, power and domination, and it is reinforced through films, through plays, through different kinds of art forms that the state and non-state actors, especially also private actors in capitalism, feel that should be fed to the audience. Now, many of this is also seen as in one way hampering what would be the process of consciousness, the ability to think. So, when there is too much standardization for neo-Marxist, it is actually a critical thing primarily because one stops imagining creativity and authenticity. So, in this kind of a setup, what often happens is that if you are making a point which is deviating from the main points or the mainstream points, it generally is seen as a deviant. Now, here apart from Theodor Adorno and his several works on the culture industry, including on popular culture, popular music and schema of mass culture, I would also like to introduce you to an essay by Walter Benjamin, which is on mechanical reproduction of art. Now, in this essay, it is a very famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. He looks at art and what happens when there is reproduction. Now, Walter Benjamin argues that art has always been reproducible, but when we introduce mechanical reproduction, it represents something new. Now, first let us understand what this reproduction or reproducibility means. The reproduction or the reproducibility is actually associated with this idea that if I have created a form of art, I can create another. Interestingly, however, that reproduction may not be actually the very similar copy of what I earlier do. For instance, if I am a painter or a sculptor and I do sculpting or painting respectively, I will be able to perhaps reproduce what I have done, but because it is also associated with human reproducibility, there could be certain differences or similarities, but no two products end up being the exact same or copies. So, this is something you notice a lot with handloom clothes, where if you buy a particular kind of sari, it may be just one piece and you will have variants of that, but you may not have the exact sari. Essentially indicating that even though these forms of art and craft, they may be reproducible, but this exact reproduction was not possible. However, with the introduction of mechanical reproduction, it sort of changes this idea of reproducibility, because now with the copying and with the reproduction available, it actually sort of accelerates the way that you can be consuming art or what would be art products. For instance, if you have a Xerox machine, it sort of copies any document that you give it to be copied, which means that there is identical stuff available for you to access. Photography in that context actually accelerated reproduction when we think about art and this idea of culture and industrialization. Now, when there is a reproduction, what happens is that there is actually, in that sense, what Walter Benjamin calls the loss of aura and authenticity being compromised. What this again means is that when we have the possibility of reproduction and primarily using the camera, I will talk about it in a little bit of details, we see that the original may not have the same value or aura as it did when it was non-reproducible. For instance, let us take an example of one of the most famous paintings in the world, the Mona Lisa, which is there in France. Now, earlier, before it was not possible to travel as we do today or access the internet as we do today, to be watching the Mona Lisa as a form of art or painting, you would have to go to Paris and be in the museum that it is housed in. However, with the coming in of photography and then also the mobile phone cameras, this idea of Mona Lisa and that you have to physically go there to look at it has completely gone away, primarily because you can click selfies with the Mona Lisa, you can click number of photos of the Mona Lisa, share it with others, etc. Interestingly, what it does is it increases the multiplicity of options to access that piece of art. However, it actually also reduces or withers away the aura of that work of art, primarily because its aura is also associated with the idea that it is original, it is one. And in this case, many people have also commented on how when there is too much reproduction, standardization, and this is a continuing thread of argument from Adorno, that authenticity in works of art gets lost. Now, when we are thinking about aura and authenticity, the question that comes to mind is also, why is aura necessary? What is it that we should do to protect that aura, or why does it need protection? Aura is actually primarily associated with uniqueness of an art form, as I have been stating, and reproduction definitely brings these objects closer to masses, but the uniqueness of it is also replaced by copies, which is why one also sees that there are people, artists, craftspeople, painters, sculptors, etc., who talk about how these forms of art need to be protected in the face of reproduction and technological advancements. So, one of the running debates now is also in terms of how does one look at art in the context of artificial intelligence, where there is a possibility of interfering with the art form at multiple levels. And in fact, this is a discussion that has been going on for some time. Many of you will be familiar with the Studio Ghibli art that was copied and then through the help of AI developed into display pictures for many of us. There were a lot of people participating in the Studio Ghibli trend, where they uploaded their pictures on social media platforms using ChatGPT and OpenAI to sort of create those images. That led to a conversation on how can we think about the authenticity of art and how should we think about protecting the authenticity of art, because today mechanical reproduction is actually also technological reproduction. So, the question that emerges from this is primarily the relationship that this reproduction, which is technological and mechanical, leads to between media, culture and society. Because we live in capitalist societies where there is this technological production and reproduction, but we also have to keep asking these questions about their impact on the culture and society. Interestingly, this AI debate is primarily also telling us about how these authors, when they were writing about perhaps the first phase of capitalism, also had a foresightedness to see how capitalism in its different phases will be impacting questions of art and culture. Now, when we think about mechanical reproduction, it also sort of does one more thing which is very crucially centered around many forms of art. Art generally is centered and based on questions of ritual, whereas mechanical reproduction in many ways liberates and emancipates it from that ritual. For instance, let us take an example that if one thinks about theatre and several forms of theatre in the Indian context, before the play begins, they actually have a particular ritual of praying to a particular deity. That deity may vary, but this ritual is very much there in many classical Sanskrit plays, in other kinds of folk theatre as well. Particularly, that ritual may include lighting of the lamp. Now, when let us say a play is recorded and may be live streamed on the internet or watched on another digital platform, this ritual no longer is part of how the form of art, in this case the play or theatre, is staged. So, what is happening is that the reproduction using technology and mechanical processes, it sort of detaches the art from that ritual which it is connected to. In most cases then, one can also see that art becomes associated only with politics. It is not to say that art and politics were completely divested and detached from each other earlier, because politics is always a part of art. Any artist who creates an art has a certain politics behind it, but there was also that ritualistic angle which with reproduction no longer exists. Now, the other thing that I want to mention here is about exhibition value, which Benjamin stresses on, where art, when it is accessible to masses primarily through photography, films, mobile phones, etc., and now the digital, art also becomes a part of exhibitions, where you can come and take a look at it and then also purchase it. Instantly, it creates a sort of capitalistic relationship between the buyers and the sellers, and this again is something which is possible with what would be called mechanical reproduction. Now, in many ways, when we think about how there is a standardization, there is more consumerism, film and media forms like the camera play very significant roles, primarily because the camera can change angles, it can fragment reality, and the audience identifies with this camera work. For instance, today if you open your smartphones and go to a photograph, you can edit it in number of ways, and those edits also contribute to how there is a loss of uniqueness of that picture, but there is also a value of that picture which is consumerist and capitalist. When we think about this question of aura and also art, again let us take the example of how we think about primarily film actors who are available today for celebrity interactions or personalized conversations, etc. One sort of sees that the kind of aura that an actor who may have had earlier in the 1980s and 90s does not really remain the same in a digital age where there is more interaction possible with that actor. So, one sees that these means of technology and the way that they have entered the discussion on art and culture, they sort of create long lasting impacts. So, primarily when we are thinking about the audience that we are targeting through these cultural products is a very mass audience, and here again I am reiterating that point where the public is thought to be just passive recipients, and the media is playing a huge role in shaping perceptions by the use of these cultural products. So, I wanted to also throw in some examples which I have also discussed throughout this lecture, is how specific films have standard formulas, and we also have these star appearances, item songs, etc., which create different sense of aura, primarily to actually attract audiences in many ways. So, Bollywood can be seen as a major example of how a cultural product gets industrialized and sold to its recipients. We also have news media, where we have discussed in terms of both the print and television media, how debates can create ideological control in terms of the consciousness, and how entertainment is merged with news. So, there is a culture industry of news as well when it is being produced. The last example that I want to talk about is very relevant to particularly young people, Indian OTT platforms, where you have algorithms directing the kind of content one consumes, and also even then the illusion of choice persisting. This is what is the pseudo individuality or agency that Adorno talks about, that you have a sense of this idea that you have an agency and control over what you watch, but actually it is directed by the system itself. Today we are discussing how even OTT platforms are not advertisement free, but the promise with which they sort of came in was that they would be ad free or distraction free. But as we are noticing gradually, that is not really the case. So, the idea of how culture is industrialized and is a very real part of the capitalistic process. So, the neo-Marxist perspective, to sum up, primarily reproduces ideology, the ideology which is hegemonic, dominant and state-centered. Culture becomes a commodity and masses become integrated into the capitalistic structure primarily through cultural products. I had mentioned in a previous class that the way the world views America as a superpower is not only because of their military prowess, it is also because of their soft power, and cultural products is a huge example of soft power. In the Indian context, a lot of Indians get to be known outside is also through Bollywood, where people have watched Bollywood films and then ask about whether or not you are from India and do you watch Bollywood films. A very interesting way to understand how we think about soft power and also masses, people, ordinary people being integrated into the capitalist structures. So, I am going to conclude this lecture by primarily saying how Adorno looks at standardization of media and controls through the process of that capitalist production of culture. Walter Benjamin looks at how mechanical reproduction changes questions of art and politics, and what they both sort of strive to is to talk about media as central to ideological domination and building consciousness. Primarily the way that the Neo-Marxist school and the Frankfurt school, they understand media is that it is a way of ideological domination, creating consciousness in society, and in a very capitalist society where culture also plays a huge role. Thank you.